Okay. So, you've got your outline. So, let's read Amos 2, verses 6 to 8, and let's discuss that first. And again, this is a prophecy about judgment against Israel, the north now. Okay? Thus says the Lord, again, same deal, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4. I will not revoke its punishment, because they sell the righteous for money and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who pant after the very dust of the earth on the head of the helpless, and turn aside the way of the humble, and a man and his daughter resort to the same girdle, in order to profane my holy name. And on garments taken as pledges, they stretch out beside every altar, and in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined. Now, let me break that down for you and see if it makes more sense. And I want you to pay attention as we discuss this about the parallels between what was going on here and what you see going on today. You're going to see a lot of parallels, and I'm going to try to point them out to you. So after summarizing the judgment of Judah, Amos turns to the detailed reasons for Israel's judgment. He begins by listing very specific violations of practices which the northern tribes did. Now, the term sell the righteous for money means that they took honest people with a small debt who would have undoubtedly paid their debt and sold them into slavery up to 6 years.
Wow.
Okay, that's what the idiom means. Then it talks about, it says, and he says, and the needy for a pair of sandals. The needy means the very, very poor. And literally it means that if they borrowed money to cover their feet with a pair of sandals and did not pay it rapidly, then they would be thrown or sold into slavery to pay that debt. Now, I want to show you.
In other words, they didn't have terms.
They had excessive terms, but the terms that they used were not God's terms. So I want to show you God's terms, okay? Now, turn to an interesting story here in 2 Kings 4. This is an example of literally what was just said. 2 Kings chapter 4. And it's a story about the prophet Elisha. And we're going to start reading verse 1. Now, a certain woman of the wives of the sons of prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, your servant my husband is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and that the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves. In other words, this woman is a widow of someone that was also a prophet of the Lord. He apparently incurred some kind of debt, and so the creditor comes, and he's going to collect her only 2 sons and place them into years of slavery to repay the debt. Verse 2, and Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, your maidservant has nothing in the house except a single jar of oil. Bare cupboard. This is all she has. Then he said, go borrow vessels at large for yourself from all of your neighbors, even empty vessels. Do not get a few. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you, and your sons and you, and pour out into all these vessels, and you shall set aside what is full. In other words, he says, you take your little jar, and you start pouring into all these accumulated pots and everything that you have from all your neighbors, and keep pouring until every one of them is full. Verse 5, so she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons, and they were pouring the vessels to her, and she poured. And it came about when the vessels were full that she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not one more vessel. And the oil stopped. And then she came and told the man of God. And he said, go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest. It's an interesting miracle.
Yeah.
And it's all about a debt.
Yeah.
In other words, Elisha was moved at how absolutely unfairly this widow was being treated. Okay? And so, through the Lord, he performs a miracle for her and gets her out of debt. Now, I want to notice a couple things here. There are many, many specific statements made in the Old Testament about how you deal with debt and debtors. There are things that you can do, and there are things you cannot do, according to God's law. So let's look at a few of them, because only by understanding this are you going to understand how bad the actions of the people of Israel were at this time, okay? So go first to Leviticus chapter 25. Go back from 2 Kings into the Torah to Leviticus chapter 25. Okay? You there? Leviticus 25, and I'm going to start in verse 39.
39.
39. All right?
Mm-hmm.
And if a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave's service. He shall be put with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner with you until the year of Jubilee. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with him, and shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers. Remember, Jubilee absolves any debt on his land, and now he becomes again the owner of that land. Okay? He says, for they are my servants who I brought out of the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold in a slave sale. For you shall not rule over him with severity. Let me read it again. You shall not rule over him with severity, but are to revere your God. As you, for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves. Well, I'll stop there, okay, at 43. So here's a principle about how you treat someone that is indebted and has to pay their debt off. All right? Now, the principle here was the principle of showing kindness and a sense of humanity to the poor person. It was to act in a way to help them resolve their debt. Turn, if you would, also to Deuteronomy chapter 15. There's another passage about how you're to deal with those who have debt. Deuteronomy 15, starting in verse 7. If there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him, and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Beware lest there is a base thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of remission is near, and your eye is hostile toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin to you. You shall generously give to him. Your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land. Now, isn't it interesting? God made very interesting provisions in the Old Testament. He didn't say that if you got into debt, you didn't have to repay your debt. Right? So therefore, he gave certain rights to the creditor. But at the same time, he also said that the debtor had certain rights also, and that the creditor could not take advantage harshly of the debtor, and he had to treat him with respect in the process of then paying off this debt that he owed.
Because one day he may be in his shoes.
Exactly. You know.
And don't we kind of do that today?
No, I don't think we do. Let me show you a lot of examples of how I think we don't.
Anyway, sometimes I think we do, but here it said also with the right heart, and I don't think we have the right heart.
Yeah, and I
At
don't.
least that's maybe not what you
I
want.
actually pay attention on that too. So you not just give,
Yeah.
just give and whatever, you know, but you
You have to get them out of your
right, but you have to have the right heart.
and something that they need or something that will be helpful to them.
Right. Okay, now, in Amos 2, go back to verse 7.
Oh, we're going back to Amos.
We're going back to Amos. Let's take verse 7 now. And let's read it again. He's talking about these creditors now. All right? He says, these who pant after the very dust of the earth on the head of the helpless, and turn aside the way of the humble, and a man and his father resort to the same girl in order to profane my holy name. Let me break that down and show you what it means. The word pant in Hebrew is the word sha'af, and it means to breathe hard in anger or to sniff aggressively to seek out. It's the mentality of in our culture, the drug-sniffing dog. It's put on a case to find the drugs, and it will not quit until it's found those drugs. This is the same concept here in the Hebrew. In other words, it's an attitude in the creditor of bloodthirstiness. That's what their attitude is towards the poor.
Give me back what's mine.
And
You don't deserve it.
I will track you down to get it.
Right.
I will track.
Changed one iota.
It hasn't. It hasn't, unfortunately.
All you gotta do is look at payday limit.
Yeah.
Hey, it's 500%.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
And we won't change that.
Yeah, usurious dealings. Usury. Now, the word dust in the Hebrew is the word afar, and it means literally to stomp into the ground, to pursue in a way that literally sends one to the grave. In other words, the poor were pursued aggressively and harshly to pay back the debt and to gain the maximum profit from the creditor. They showed no regard for humility or kindness in their dealings with the poor.
Capone and John Gotti.
You know? In other words, I'm going to get my pound of flesh one way or the other. Right?
Right.
So, now, let's go on to the second part of verse 7.
I left one out. Joe Kennedy.
He was terrible.
Yeah,
Oh.
that's true. So, it also talks in this statement about a man and his father resort to the same young woman. A young woman could be sold into slavery for a debt of the family. Okay? But what it's saying here is that these people, when this young girl was sold into slavery for payment of the debt, would sexually violate her, both the father and the son, and sexually use her in the same time that she was supposed to do physical work to pay off the debt of the family. Therefore, they completely violated the rights of the girl. Now let's look at a couple principles of what God says people can and cannot do, all right? Specifically in relationship to a young woman who would have to serve some time to repay a debt. We're going to be in Exodus and Deuteronomy. So turn back to Exodus, chapter 22. Exodus 22, and we're going to look first at verses 16 and 17. If a man seduces a virgin who he's not engaged to and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. He must pay a dowry to her to be his wife. In other words, if he's taken that act, he is obligated on two levels, to marry her and to pay. Now, verse 17, if her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the dowry, what's called the dowry for virgins. Okay? In other words, she is to be respected as a person, even to the point not only of her rights in marriage, but also even an economic value in that sense, a dowry. Now go over from Exodus 22, go back to Exodus 21, one page. Exodus 21, and let's look starting at verse 7. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. In other words, if he says, I don't really like this girl too much, there's an amount of money that could be paid to redeem her back to her family. Okay? He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. He cannot separate her from her family in that way. Verse 9, and if he designates her for his son, if he decides, this girl's pretty nice, she's serving her, and I think this would be a good match for my son, okay? He shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. In other words, at that point, she's not his female slave anymore, okay? Verse 10, if he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. In other words, if he married her, okay? And if he will not do these things, three things for her, just mentioned, then she shall go out for nothing without payment or money. So if he doesn't provide those three to her, then he forfeits the debt. Gone.
How does she manage to collect if he does that with the force that the man had over the
Well, because the point is, you had judges among Israel, and you always had the two-witness system. So any two people that would witness this occurring, she could call them to a judge and say, look, and if they found evidence, then the judge would say, buddy, that's done.
What prevented them from literally killing her if she decided to do that?
Well, I guess nothing, in the sense that it's like we're seeing here. These are all God-specific rules. But what we're seeing in Amos 2 is how they completely violated them.
That's the reason for the question.
Right. So I want you to understand that God had a very elaborate system for debt, repayment, creditors, debtors, length of time, redemption, justice, all these things. It was all very laid out, what you could and couldn't do. But what we're seeing here in Amos is these people completely violated these principles. Okay, one more. Turn to Deuteronomy 16. And let's look at one more principle that God lays down. Deuteronomy 16, starting in verse 18.
Deuteronomy 18, 126.
Oh, yeah, I did. I'm not going to go
It
into
was the same. Okay.
It's a long passage.
Oh, okay.
You can read it on your own if you care to. Now, this is an extremely important principle, what we're going to read. Very important, okay? Starting verse 18. You shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in all of your towns which the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice. You shall not be partial. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Isn't that a statement? Okay, how many examples do you want to cite of that one? Verse 20, justice and only justice you shall pursue, that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Bottom line, there can be no collusion between a judge and a person that has a case. No collusion. Okay? Has to be a fair, impartial hearing about the case. Now, how does that apply to today? So, I have some articles that I'd like to read some excerpts from to give you an idea. The first one is from the publication The Guardian, and let me make certain I'm right about this. Yeah. And it's called America's Private Prison System is a National Disgrace. All right? It is, this was published in 2013. Let me read a few excerpts here. The complaint about private prisons lists a litany of such horrors, but here are a few highlights. In private prisons, you have rampant rapes, placing prisoners in solitary confinement for weeks, months, or sometimes even years at a time, where the only way to get a guard's attention is to make an emergency by setting a fire. In private prisons, rat infestations are so bad that vermin crawl all over the prisoners. It is particularly bad for the mentally ill inmates. Many suicide attempts occur, some being successful. The untreated mentally ill throw feces, scream, start fires, electrocute themselves, and self-mutilate. Denying or delaying treatment for infections and even cancer is commonplace. Stabbings, beatings, and other acts of violence occur regularly. Juveniles end up being housed often with adults, including, for instance, in our investigation, one 16-year-old who was sexually assaulted by his adult cellmate over and over again. Malnourishment was found common and chronic hunger prevailed. A severely ill 16-year-old in our investigation with, quote, a long history of being physically and sexually abused, in addition to suffering traumatic brain injury with limited intellectual functioning and self-harm tendencies, episodes of psychosis, was moved from a juvenile detention center. He was put into the adult private prison. His cell allegedly had a broken lock, and so other prisoners were free to enter into his cell. 5 or 6 of them would come in at a time and beat him. He was moved to solitary confinement unit, and when he voiced his suicidal ideations and asked to see a psychiatrist, he was deemed as, quote, being manipulative about wanting to be moved. These kind of abuses are not relegated to any one single private prison, but they also aren't inherent in any detention system. In the United States, they actually seem to be business as usual. Our prison system is increasingly built and run on for-profit corporations who have financial interests in increasing the number of persons in prison while decreasing the amount of money it costs to house each one of them. Since 1980, the U.S. prison population has grown by 800%. We have the largest prison population in any nation in the history of the world. It goes on and talks about then by demographic, et cetera, et cetera. Now, let me also...
There's another country they just go on or cut off my head or they're on.
Well, but interestingly enough, we have a higher rate of incarceration than Iran, Russia, or China.
Like she said, that's because
Okay.
they're more afraid to do anything bad.
Well, they may be more afraid, for instance, in China, and you would be a good authority on that one. But the point is, we incarcerate way more people. All right? Let me read another one here. This is called Banking on Bondage, Private Prisons and Mass Incarceration. This is put out as a working document, actually, by the ACLU.
You're reading something from the ACL?
I am, because in this case, I think they're right. The report finds that mass incarcerations provides a giant windfall for one special interest group, the private prison industry. As the public good suffers from mass incarceration, private prison companies obtain more and more government dollars, and private prison executives at the leading companies rake in enormous compensation packages, in some cases totaling millions of dollars in extra pay. The crippling cost of imprisoning increases the number of Americans and saddles the government budgets with rising debt and exacerbates the current physical crises among the states. Leading private prison companies essentially admit that their business model depends on high rates of incarceration. For example, in a 2010 annual report filed with the Securities Exchange Commission, the Corrections Corporation of America, which is one of the biggest ones in the United States, the largest private prison company, stated, quote, "The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices." In other words, it's telling the judges, give longer terms, put them in more secure places, and incarcerate more so that we can make more money. All right? Incarceration rates have skyrocketed since the private prison industry has expanded. It says that private prisons for adults were virtually non-existent until the early 1980s.
You know why?
Because they were all state-owned, state-run.
3 strikes and you're out already. And it started with the push on drugs.
Yeah, it did. You're right.
And there are so many people that were put into prison that were, in essence, somebody that should have seen you, not in prison.
Yeah. And of course, that's part of what they say in these reports, is that they then imprisoned minor offenders in with incarcerated long-term felons. And so what did they teach the minor offenders? How to be long-term felons, how to be career criminals. Okay?
And the thing that's amazing, if you look back and look at some of the things you're bringing up, is how O.J. Simpson was treated. He didn't go through any of that, and he got into private prison. And so when you look at a lot of those things, and I mentioned John Gotti, if you see the way John Gotti's treated, I mean, he's a Saudi prince.
Yeah. Of course, there are exceptions, but basically, these are the documents, talking about the studies that have been done on these
Okay,
things.
you just told us what it is. What would be your version of how to avoid that?
Well,
Don't get caught.
Well, we need, and I'm going to go into another one here too in a minute, okay? We need to have fair judges with fair sentences and fair laws, and because what we're doing with the private prison system is we're making a justice system to a great extent dependent on how much profit the private prison system can make. So it's not about, in many cases, the justice of a sentence. It's about the need of the private prison system for prisoners.
I don't know whether I agree or disagree because it's the first time I've ever heard this, but I know, and what you read, you keep hearing about some of these clowns that, you know, rob and beat and steal and kill. And they're automatically seems like thrown into jail. And then some of them get out. And some of them are there forever.
Right.
All depends on the money.
Well, it depends on a lot of things. It depends on how good a lawyer you have.
Well, money.
Okay,
Right.
you know. Let me read one more thing here. This is under their paragraph called shrewd tactics. Certain private prison companies employ shrewd tactics to obtain more and more government contracts to incarcerate more and more people. In February 2011, for example, a jury convicted former Luzerne County, Pennsylvania judge Mark Ciavarella of racketeering charges, racketeering conspiracy, and money laundering conspiracy in connection with payments he received from the private prison system. Okay? He was enabling them to get contracts to do business, and of course doing it illegally. The point is,
the prison sentence, or the prisons, the independent private prisons are of the governor's administration, whether they want to have them bid for that job and take over a state prison, or if they want to continue.
that's partly true, but only 6% currently, as of 2015, of state prisons were private prisons, but 19% of federal prisons were privately run. The federal government is in this way more, 3 times more than the states are.
Well, if you look at the private prison that a woman named Martha Stewart stayed at in West Virginia,
Yeah.
that's about like the Hilton.
Did she decorate it while she was in there?
Yes, she did.
Yes, she did.
She literally did. Isn't that interesting?
And she taught cooking and
Yeah.
all kinds of other things.
Well, again, it's the point is that, you know, those convicted under a crime are not all treated the same.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's the point. That is an injustice.
Right.
It is not what God intended for a penalty or for a judge to give a penalty.
And I think
You know.
it had to do with money. Because if you can afford,
Of course,
you know, everything and anything, you get off. So
that's part of it.
And then, but they're talking here, God's talking about fairness, whether you're rich, poor, or otherwise, you know, no matter how much debt you owe. I mean, the woman who had nothing and so on and so forth.
Okay, let's go back to Amos 2, and let's take verse 8. Verse 8 says, "And on garments taken as pledges they stretch out beside every altar, and in the house of their God they drink the wine, the house of their God." Okay, they drink wine of those who have been fined. Now, what you find is that in the Old Testament, certain items could be held as collateral for debt. They could be held in certain ways for certain periods of time. Some items could not be held as collateral at all. For instance, you could not use demand as collateral a mill wheel. It was illegal according to God. Why?
Provided their food, because
Yeah, exactly. Because how could farmers therefore provide, you know, for the crushing of grain to make for bread, etc., like this? And so you couldn't do it. It was God said it's forbidden. You can't take his mill wheel as collateral.
Well, what about the food itself? What about the grains?
Some you could, some you couldn't. I'm going to give you some examples here. Okay. That's okay. I'm going to give you some examples. Another one is, for instance, the coat of the poor could not be held overnight. If you took his coat as collateral, when it came to evening, you had to give him back his coat. You could get it back from him in the morning. What's the whole point?
Freezing.
Exactly. You couldn't let him be cold at night. Okay. All right. That's one of the laws. All right. Now let's turn to Exodus 22. I'm going to show you a few more of these. Exodus chapter 22.
Wouldn't that show how honest, in that particular case, how honest the person would be to give the coat back, and then take the coat, and then give the coat back?
Yeah. It also means that they are obeying the law that God, here, starting in verse 26. Okay, Exodus 22. If you ever take your neighbor's coat as a pledge, you will return it to him before the sun sets. Verse 27. For that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about that when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. Okay? Here's an example of a prohibition.
I'm wondering how Pharisees were doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, not very well.
Not very well, I guess.
Turn also to Deuteronomy 24 as another example of this. I'm just giving you a few. There are many, many examples of the regulation God puts on the issue of collateral.
I'm sorry, you're last.
What does it mean?
Collateral.
24.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Collateral means something that is held in lieu of a debt that you owe.
Lease
Like,
on a
like
car.
if someone who's in the prison and they pay money and they let him out.
No, that's called a bond. Now, collateral is, for instance, if Mikey goes to the bank and he says, I need $1,000 cash, they'll say to him, well, what collateral do you have? And he says, well, I've got this piece of equipment. And they go, okay, we'll give you $1,000, but now they put what's called a lien on his equipment for $1,000. So they have a right to it if he doesn't pay, okay? But if he pays it, then the lien has to be removed. That's called collateral. Okay?
And
Any,
if he takes money and runs away with it,
then they'll hunt him down like a dog.
and they'll throw him in prison.
If they do it for $1,000, Mikey wasn't thinking.
That's right. Okay, Deuteronomy, let's see what I say, 24, 10 through 13. Because when you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not enter his house to take his pledge. In other words, it's not your business to go in his house to see what he has. Okay? The pledge that's agreed upon is the pledge. You can't just rifle through his property, okay? I think we call that the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution in the United States. Okay? You shall remain outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he's a poor man, you shall not sleep with his pledge. In other words, you can't keep it overnight. All right? So I'm just giving you a few examples
What the heck
of
are
this.
you supposed to do with it?
Well, you've got to return it to him at sunset. In some cases, not all cases. Again, I'm only giving you a smattering of these, but I'm trying to show you how elaborately God legislates this, so that injustice doesn't occur to people. Either the injustice of ripping someone off when you borrowed, or the injustice of the creditor harshly treating the one that owes. God made this balance.
All in detail.
Yes. Okay? Now,
Now, was this only in Israel that they were doing this balance that you're talking
yes.
about?
Yes.
No other place.
Well, maybe, but we're talking about Israel.
Chosen people.
We're talking about God's law in the Torah here that we're reading, okay? Now, so we see that a widow's garments could never be used as collateral, ever.
Mm-hmm.
She had a right to her garments. No one could take them as collateral, even if she had debt. what we find here in Amos is this instance that not only did creditors violate these laws, they would take forbidden garments and they would go to pagan feasts and lay them on the altars as they then had the pagan feasts. In other words, an absolute, complete defiance of God. It's almost like it's bad enough you're having a pagan feast, but now we're violating your law about debt, and we're putting the evidence of it right on top of the altar. You know?
It's sacred.
Okay? Also, you'll find that, I'm not going to go into it, but wine was one of those foods that was not allowed to be used as collateral.
How the heck did you get drunk Friday night?
That's right. You couldn't go to the local Jewish bar or whatever, okay? Wine was not allowed to be collateral. So what does it say here?
Well, they were putting the poor person that had the tavern out of business.
That's right. What does it say at the end of verse 8? And in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined. Mm-hmm. So they're collecting wine from them illegally and drinking it during their pagan parties. Okay? Again, an absolute, complete.
Let's call it orgy.
Yeah, exactly. Defiance.
Right.
Those Friday nights must have been a real out.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, they got it on, did they not?
We can tell you had quite a time.
I did too.
Now, I want to again make an analogy here with our society, okay? I want to read you some excerpts from a report just a couple years ago it was done. It's called Taken. New report finds civil forfeiture laws are fueling explosive growth in property seizures. All right? So,
08.
Pardon?
08.
Yeah, that's when some of these things started.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a 2015 study. Okay, it says that the federal government's civil forfeiture schemes are estimated by the Institute of Justice, this group that is doing this, as a D- as a grade. In addition to meager protections for property and due process rights, the federal law gives law enforcement a strong financial incentive to take property regardless of the owner's guilt or innocence. 100% of the proceeds. Did you hear that?
Yes.
Okay. Under civil forfeiture laws, police and prosecutors can seize cash, cars, homes, and other property on the mere suspicion that it might be connected to criminal activity.
That's correct.
No charges or convictions are required. And once property is seized, owners must navigate a confusing, complex, and often extremely expensive legal process to try to win back their property which has been forfeited. Worst of all, most civil forfeiture laws give law enforcement agencies a powerful incentive to take property. They give them a cut or sometimes even all the value of the forfeiture proceeds.
That's on the state.
Right. Such financial incentives combined with weak protections for property owners increasingly put people's property at risk. Nationwide forfeiture revenue has exploded. Since 2001, annual federal forfeiture revenue has increased from less than $500 million in 2001 to over $5 billion in 2014, a tenfold increase in 14 years.
But you know why?
There's a lot of reasons why.
So is this what they're talking about when they say, they want that property for a new bridge?
No.
Or a new...
No.
No.
All right.
It's eminent domain.
Yeah, I know that, but I was asking if...
No, this means that, for instance, if the police stop Mikey, we're picking on Mikey tonight.
That's
It's
all right.
already been through it.
Okay.
And he knows.
That's right, that's true.
Red.
Okay. And they say, we think that you may have some drugs in your car.
I can smell them.
Okay, I can smell them. Or we have the canine here, and they think they smell drugs. Okay, and so they go through his car, and let's say no drugs are found. They impound his car and take it, and he then has to go through the expense of getting it back, potentially going to court to get it back, and could find, and this is what they want, could find that he's going to pay more money to get it back than it's worth, so he just has to forfeit the car.
That happens.
Does that sound
Yeah.
familiar, Michael?
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now,
Did you have drugs in your car?
No. That we did not.
now, let me give you some examples. There have been people in the last,
Drive.
It could have been any worse.
there have been people in the last several years when they went out of town, whose children decided to have drug parties. So they bring drugs unknown to the parents, forbidden by the parents, into the home. The police are called. The police find the drugs, and what happens to the parents' property? They seize their property because their stupid teenage children had a party they didn't know about. I mean, I'm telling you, this can be very serious. And the government has become very liberal in its allowing this. You know, now, this is exactly the mentality that we're talking about in the book of Amos. It's collusion that gives the advantage to the government or the judge or the police over the right of the citizen.
Can you explain in terms of the Muslim religion, and take Turkey as an example, the Ottoman Empire, how they functioned versus what you're discussing in Jerusalem in Amos?
Well, I don't know all the details under Islamic law, okay? I would say that Islamic law in general is fiercely rigid. It's fiercely intolerant. There is no mercy to it. And so, you know, if, for instance, under Islamic law, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, if you caught stealing, what will it cost you? Your hand. There is no recourse. That's what's going to happen. You know, if you're found as a woman not wearing a habib correctly, they take you into a public square and beat you mercilessly, okay, almost to the point of unconsciousness. It shows no humanity whatsoever. Here we're seeing in the Torah all of these checks and balances that are supposed to be, okay, so that you're not allowed to get away with simply creating debt and ripping people off, but at the same time, the creditor is not allowed to beat you to death in the process of trying to collect. So
Where are we now? I'm sorry.
I just finished verse 8 of Amos 2.
Okay.
Can I make a comment in
Yes.
relationship to what you were just discussing? I was at a lunch yesterday and sitting next to a high-ranking military officer who had just come back from Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis, with the new prince, has eliminated those things you just discussed about women. And he is changing this radically under his law, not Islam. And he's giving, it's amazing that they can go out in public and dress just like us. And right or wrong, Iran is now the same way.
Iran has loosened up its standards, and part of the reason why Iran loosened its standards is because they had young people by the hundreds of thousands marching on the streets, and they realized they were either going to loosen the laws or they were going to have their government overrun. So sometimes you tip to the point that people say, all right, let's read verses 9 and 10, because we need to get all the way through 16 tonight.
Oh, we only got 5 minutes.
All right, so 9 and 10. Amos 2. Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, though his height was like the height of the cedars, and he was strong as the oaks. I even destroyed his fruit above and his root below. It was I who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, and I led you in the wilderness for 40 years, that you might take possession of the land of the Amorite. So, the point God's making here is, you treat your fellow Jew this way, and yet I was the one that showed you all of this graciousness and all of this kindness and all of these miracles to you, and yet you can't respond by showing your fellow Jew kindness.
But the proverb of Jesus,
Yes.
very terrible.
Yes, it's the parable about the wicked slave that owed his master, and his master forgave him this massive amount of money, and then he had a fellow slave that owed him a pittance, and he threw him in prison. You know, exactly, it's that. We see, if you want to, let's do it just for the sake of these important principles. Turn to Leviticus chapter 19. You should know this verse, Leviticus 19:18. And there's a reason why you should know it.
I'm sorry, can I? Leviticus 19.
Leviticus 19:18. Okay? Says, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Where have you heard that before? See? Jesus quoted two verses when he talked about the greatest commandment. He quoted Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4, 5, and 6, and added to it Leviticus 19:18, and that's where we get the great love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, might, and neighbor as yourself. Just two different verses from the Torah that he put together. All right, now back to Amos, verses 11 and 12. He says, then I raised up some of your sons to be prophets, and some of you young men to be Nazarites. Is this not so, O sons of Israel, declares the Lord? But you made the Nazarites drink wine, and you commanded the prophets, saying, you shall not prophesy. Turn to Numbers chapter 6. And we're not going to read all of this. You can read more of it on your own. But Numbers chapter 6 is where we talk about Nazarite vows. You should remember the fact that Jesus was from Nazareth and he was called a Nazarene. Okay, so Nazarite vow. So here's how it starts. Verse 1, taking Nazarite vow. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of the Nazarite, to dedicate himself to the Lord, he shall abstain from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar, whether made from wine or strong drink, neither shall he drink any grape juice, nor eat fresh or dried grapes. All the days of his separation he shall not eat anything that is produced by the grapevine, or the seeds, etc., etc. And it goes all the way through to, I think, chapter to verse 21. It's all these details. A Nazarite vow was simply a vow that you took for a period of time. Okay? John the Baptist was a Nazarite. Okay? It was a vow you took for a period of time that you consecrated yourself for a special time to the Lord. And one of the elements, there are many elements to it, one of them is you did not drink wine during that time. So what he's saying here is that the people that tried to take a Nazarite vow at this time, the book of Amos, they constantly were being tempted by everyone around them to make them drink wine to break their vow.
Yeah.
Okay? Hey, what this?
You try to quit smoking.
Everyone hands you a cigarette.
Everyone will
Right.
give a cigarette.
Okay. Then he says, and you commanded the prophets, saying, you shall not prophesy. Now, turn towards the back of the book of Amos and I want you to look at chapter 7. We'll get here in a few weeks, but here's what he means by this, starting in verse 10. He says, Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent word to Jeroboam. This would be Jeroboam the second of Israel. Okay? The guy that was the king just before they get judged. Okay? Jeroboam the second. Saying, Amos has conspired against you and all in the midst of the house of Israel. The land is unable to endure all his words. For thus Amos says, quote, Jeroboam will die by the sword, and Israel will certainly go into its land into exile. Then Amaziah the high priest said to Amos, Go, you seer, flee away to the land of Judah. In other words, get out of Israel and go south. He says, and there eat bread, and there do your prophesying. But no longer prophesy at Bethel, for it's a sanctuary of the king, a royal residence. In other words, don't come to Washington, D.C. and do your protest. We don't want to hear it because that's not what we want to hear.
That's my residence.
It's my residence.
Right, we're king, and therefore
Exactly.
keep it picture perfect.
So they were to the point where they absolutely would not put up with any prophet's prophecy. Unwilling to hear it, and told the prophets, shut up. Don't say it. Do you see any similar mentality in the United States and Canada in the last several years?
Right.
Any florists you've heard about? Any cake bakers?
The cake guy won his
I know.
in wonder, but it took a long time.
It took a long time and a lot of money.
No one.
But the beauty of it is, they had an avenue, and they went up the avenue and won their
Yeah,
point.
and they were fortunate that they had a 5-4 majority to win it.
Right.
They did. But at any rate, we see these abuses occurring. You know, it started, frankly, with the prohibition of having prayer of any sort in school. It's progressed all the way since then, you know, and of course, we see this mentality. So let's read verses 13 through 16.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
It has to do with Donald Trump
Okay.
and kneeling for the national anthem, and then Philadelphia ball players refusing to go to the White House. Comment?
I can give you my personal comment.
Well, that's what I was asking.
My personal comment is last fall when they refused to kneel, I quit watching NFL football. I'd watch it the rest of the year.
Well, a whole bunch of people.
I mean, if they're going to be morons and disrespect the flag, the nation, the pledge, and everything else, I don't need to watch it. And they, of course, got, you know, bit in the you-know-what by commercial sales, you know. Before they quit panning to show the audience, which towards the end of the season they wouldn't even pan the audience because there were so few people in the stands, it was embarrassing to them. All right? We'll see what the compromise is this year.
I was going to say, it doesn't sound like a real good one because they're still, if they're not out on the field, it's obvious that they're not agreeing. It's the same thing as to me.
I will only say this. It's better to me because I have to see it. I guess if they want to be morons in the locker room, I don't have to see them being morons then.
What's your projection with Golden State Warriors? They won the NBA.
Yeah.
They're going to get invited to the White House.
I don't know. You know, I mean, I think that it's the lunacy.
Understand why I'm asking the question, because it relates to exactly what
Well, I'm the Philadelphia team, you know.
Sure.
I think the point is that in the past history of this country, despite one's party affiliation, the president was shown reasonable respect, okay, and that people would go and do these things if they were invited. Now we have a mentality, just like we had with our dear friend the other night, the Golden Globe Awards. Okay,
I didn't watch it.
I won't
We watch
repeat.
it.
I won't repeat what he said because it's obscene.
Oh, yeah, they,
Okay,
older.
Robert De Niro.
Yes, I
Okay.
didn't see it, but I heard
You
it
know.
was really bad.
Can you imagine anyone doing that about Barack Obama? Never. They would have been called out. They would have been called racist. They would have been
Going off the stage.
absolutely. So we have a complete double standard, and that's what we have.
Well,
Complete double.
for De Niro's personal advice, saying that, showing his personal disgrace, his personal low level, and who he really is.
He did. Matter of fact, Laura Ingraham commented the next day about this, and actually a liberal writer in the New York Times commented and said if the Democrats keep doing these things, they might as well hand the Republicans the midterm elections.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're alienating everyone
Right.
except the most ardent liberals.
Yeah.
Did you hear what Alyssa Milano said about the whole gun thing? It's time to put out the thoughts and the prayers, get rid of the thoughts and the prayers and start action about the whole gun thing.
I mean,
So
confiscation.
she got up there and just said, enough of the thoughts and prayers. Just get rid of the thoughts and prayers.
Yeah,
And
like she
Who
was
was that?
praying before
Alyssa
that.
Milano. She's an actress.
Well, of course, my response to Hollywood about gun confiscation is let you be first.
Yeah.
You get rid of all your security details. You disarm every person around you
Right.
from every single defense, and then go ahead.
Mhm.
You start first, and they'll never do it.
The funniest thing is when she says that, it sounds like almost like, what's she like, praying prior to that?
This is just like the situation where it's why the founders did the Bill of Rights. It's why the founders wrote the things, because Britain took away their freedom of religion. Britain took away everything.
Right.
There's, the whole purpose of the Young Amendment was to be a militia to put a stop to the stupidity.
Illegal government,
Right.
That's
illegal actions of government. Absolutely.
Okay, land the plane, Tim.
Let's land the plane, verses 13 through 16.
That's
Okay.
a good one. I'll remember that one.
13 and,
scenery.
oh,
13 through 16, chapter 2.
Really.
Behold,
He always says that.
I am weighed down beneath you. As a wagon is weighed down, then filled with sheaves. Okay? In other words, what he's saying is the result of what's going to happen in the judgment against Israel is going to totally crush them. Totally crush them. Just like if you took a wagon of wood and put, tons and tons and tons of grain in it. The wheels collapse, the whole thing falls apart. He says that's
You don't fight God.
That's right. Then he goes in and he identifies 6 elements that will be true when this judgment occurs. Okay?
Now will we have another stage?
Right, on the back. And what he says is, those who try to run will be caught. Secondly, he says the strong man will not succeed. Thirdly, he says the skilled warrior will not win. Fourthly, he says the skilled archer would have to run and thus not be effective. You can't really run and shoot very well, okay,
Unless you're Indian.
on a horse.
On a horse.
And fifthly, the swift soldier would not outrun his enemy. And finally, even the horseman would not escape. Now, let's read the historical example, the actual history of this occurring. Turn to 2 Kings 17. This is where we have the end of Israel. 2 Kings 17. Starting verse 1. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hosea, the son of Elah, got this right. Yeah, 2 Kings 17. He says, and king of over Samaria, reigned 9 years, and did evil was in sight of the Lord, not only to as the kings of Israel who were before him. Shalmaneser, okay, who is the king of Assyria. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hosea became his servant and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hosea, who had sent messengers to sow the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done the year by year. So the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. Do you see what's happened? He's been paying tribute to Shalmaneser and the other Assyrian kings before him. And the king of Israel decides, I'm going to be cute, and I'm going to apply to the Pharaoh for military support. It doesn't work. Shalmaneser hears of it and says, you're done. Okay? In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away into exile to Assyria and settled them in Hala and Harbor on the river Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. And then it goes on and talks about the sins of Israel and what they did and why this all happened to them. And you can go on all the way through verse 23 and read the history here in the Bible of this. Now, I want to finish tonight by reading some excerpts from an article called Assyrian Conquest of the Lost Tribes. It was put out in a journal, actually a biblical commentary type journal, 1982 version, starting on page 113. And this talks about the dynamics of Assyrian warfare. Now, I want you to keep in mind what God said Israel would be like. It would be like a wagon weighed down by too much grain that would collapse. Okay, here's Assyrian military tactics. Assyria perfected modern warfare in their time in this era. They had infantry, chariots, cavalry, sappers, iron armor, siege machines, battering rams, and innovative tactics all developed by the Assyrians. Tactics were once a city was captured, it was plundered, and the city burnt to the ground. They then cut down all the trees in all the landscape around them. Troops then were motivated by taking spoils that they could find, and additionally, they were paid for every severed head brought them from the battle. So the whole towns would end up being decapitated. Prisoners who were not decapitated were then quickly later killed after the battle. The Assyrians had scribes who would stand by and tally the counts of the severed heads of the dead so that they could figure rewards for the soldiers. Nobles of countries captured weren't always killed immediately, but their noses, ears, hands, and feet were cut off from their bodies. Some were flayed alive, roasted over fires. They often skinned their prisoners alive or impaled them on sharpened poles. They also tore out tongues and sometimes bound prisoners after torture and would feed them in cages to dogs, swine, and wolves for their children to watch and learn from. This is what Israel faced when God said,
That repeated itself, first of all, in Vietnam on body count when you're dealing with West Coast, McNamara and Johnson, because that literally